close your eyes for a moment, or perhaps let them rest on the dim spaces where the shadows gather at the edge of your room, and let your mind drift backward through the modern architecture of steel and neon, past the rumbling trains and the concrete towers, down into the soft, unpaved earth of a past that has long since fallen silent. We find ourselves in the early decades of the 17th century, in an era known to the scribes as the Edo period, a time when the great wars had finally sputtered out into a heavy, watchful peace. The country, under the iron hand of the Tokugawa shogunate, has closed its heavy wooden gates to the outside world, turning inward, like a dreamer pulling a thick quilt over their shoulders in the deep of winter. You are standing on the damp, salt-kissed floor of a quiet port along the coast, far from the grand, bustling capital, yet entirely bound to its invisible, twisting web of laws. The evening air is thick, carrying the sharp, briny scent of wet seaweed, the musk of old cedar wood drying in the sun, and the faint, sweet trace of charcoal smoke from a nearby kitchen. Listen closely, and you can hear the slow, rhythmic lap of the dark sea against the wooden piles of the pier, a steady, hypnotic pulse that has measured out the lives of fishermen, merchants, and secret lovers for hundreds of years. It is here, in the quiet spaces between the grand proclamations of generals and the ledger entries of wealthy traders, that the real history of human warmth begins, a history written not in stone or gold, but in the soft rustle of silk, the fragrance of burning incense, and the quiet, heavy sighs of individuals trying to find a moment of closeness in a world that demanded absolute obedience. As the twilight deepens, casting long, bruised shadows across the narrow pathways of the port town, you begin to understand the strange architecture of this society. Everything is ordered, everything has its precise, unyielding place. The samurai walks with two swords clacking against his hip, his face a mask of iron discipline, while the humble merchant bows low into the date, hiding his gold beneath the plain, dark cotton of a standard worker's coat. To step out of line, to love the wrong person, or to touch someone from a different station was not merely a private scandal, it was an act of quiet rebellion against the state itself. And yet, human nature, much like the weeds that push their green fingers up through the tightly packed cobblestones of the castle towns, could never be entirely suppressed. You see it in the way the houses are built, huddled close together, sharing thin walls made of woven plaster and delicate paper screens, paths so narrow that when two people pass each other in the rainy season, the old paper umbrellas must tilt and slide past one another like the wings of nocturnal birds. This physical closeness meant that every whisper was shared. Every midnight footstep on the creaking floorboards was recorded by a neighbor's attentive ear, and privacy, as we might think of it today, was a luxury that simply did not exist. To find intimacy in such a world was to become an artist of the small gesture, a quick glance exchanged across a crowded fish market, a hand briefly brushing against another while reaching for a ladle at the local well, or a tiny, carefully folded scrap of paper dropped into a deep sleeve while walking past the sake shop. Let us walk together down one of these dimming alleyways, where the mud is drying into gray powder and the dogs are curling themselves into tight circles beneath the eaves of the low-roof buildings. The sky above is the color of a bruised plum, and the first stars are beginning to pierce the heavy, damp canopy of the coastal air. You notice that the doors of the houses are already being slid shut for the night, interlocking wooden grates that bar the chaos of the dark from the domestic world within. Inside, the primary source of light is the anden, a simple, square lantern made of a cedar frame wrapped in translucent mulberry paper, with a small brass dish of rapeseed oil sitting in its belly. The light it throws is weak, flickering, and remarkably kind. It softens the sharp lines of a tired face, turns a plain room into a sanctuary of golden shadows, and creates an intimate, enclosed universe where only the people sitting directly beside the flame truly exist. In this gentle illumination, the grand social hierarchies of the shogunate begin to melt away. It does not matter if one is a wealthy rice broker or a penniless weaver when the light only extends 3 feet from the wick. Hey, the senses awaken. You smell the sharp, slightly bitter aroma of the rapeseed oil burning, mixed with the deep, earthy scent of the rushgrass tatami mats that lined the floor. It is a smell that every person of this era carried in their clothes, a domestic fragrance that meant warmth, safety, and the presence of others. In the quiet of these evening rooms, courtship was an elaborate, slow-moving game of patience, where the written word often carried far more weight than physical presence. Imagine the deliberation required to write a love letter in this quiet port. You do not simply grab a pen and scribble your thoughts on a whim. No, the act itself is a ritual that requires your entire being to slow down. First, you must take a solid stick of black pine soot ink and rub it patiently against the wet surface of an inkstone, back and forth, in steady, circular motions, watching the water slowly darken and thicken into a glossy, midnight fluid. The sound of the stone scratching against the inkstick is a soft, rhythmic scrape, a sound that fills the quiet room like the ticking of an ancient, wooden clock. Then, you select your paper, perhaps a sheet of fine, textured washi made by hand in a mountain village, its edges slightly frayed and soft to the touch. You choose a brush with hairs plucked from the winter coat of a mountain deer or a badger, and only then, when your breath has grown even and your mind is emptied of the day's trivialities, do you allow the ink to touch the paper. The characters you write are not just words, they are an expression of your soul, your breeding, and your desire. A line that slopes too sharply to the left might reveal a hidden impatience. An ink blot that runs too thick could betray a lack of emotional control. The recipient, reading your message by their own flickering oil lamp, will analyze every stroke, searching for the unspoken feelings hidden between the columns of vertical script. And then, there is the matter of the fragrance. Before the letter is folded into a tight, secure knot, it must be subjected to the art of kodo, the way of incense. A true gentleman or lady of the Edo period would never dream of sending a plain, unscented piece of paper. You would take a small piece of aromatic wood, perhaps precious cigar wood brought by Dutch ships to the southern ports, or native cypress mixed with dried cloves and star anise, and you would light it, allowing the sweet, heavy smoke to billow up around the letter. The paper absorbs the oils of the smoke, trapping the scent within its fibers so that when your lover opens the seal days later in a completely different town, the very air around them will be transformed. They will breathe in the exact scent of your room, the exact mood of your evening, and for a moment, the vast distances imposed by muddy roads and feudal checkpoints will simply vanish. This was an intimacy of the mind and the nose, a delicate, sensory bridge built across the quiet distances of an empire. It required a profound capacity for imagination, a willingness to let a single scent or a line of elegant calligraphy evoke the entire warmth of a human body. But let us not romanticize this world entirely, for it was also a place of profound restrictions and quiet, domestic tragedies. In these coastal towns and rural villages, marriage was rarely an affair of the heart. It was a contract, a legal and economic arrangement designed to ensure the survival of the household, the continuity of the family business, or the security of a rice farm. A young woman would be given to a family she barely knew, her teeth blackened with a special iron-rich dye called ohaguro to signify her status as a married woman, a practice that seems strange to our modern eyes but was considered a mark of great elegance and maturity at the time. The blackening of the teeth effectively erased the individual expression of her smile, turning her mouth into a dark, mysterious void that revealed nothing of her inner thoughts. It was a visual symbol of the domestic realm, a declaration that her private self now belonged entirely to the shadows of her new home. For many such couples, true intimacy did not precede marriage. It had to be grown slowly, like a pine tree clinging to a rocky cliffside, cultivated over decades through the shared labor of cooking, cleaning, and surviving the bitter winter winds that blew off the sea. Yet, humans are resourceful creatures, and when the official structures of society offer no room for personal affection, people inevitably find the gaps in the stone walls. In the Edo period, these gaps were often found in the twilight hours, after the evening bells had rung from the local temple. their deep, bronze vibrations rolling across the tile roofs and settling into the hills. It was during these hours that the practice of yobai, or night calling, existed in many rural communities, a custom deeply rooted in ancient folklore and often tolerated by village elders despite the strict moral codes of the shogunate's officials. Imagine a young man slipping out of his family's house in the dead of night, his feet bare against the cool, damp grass, his body wrapped in a simple dark robe to blend with the shadows of the bamboo graves. He moves without a lantern, relying entirely on the silver light of a crescent moon filtering through the clouds and his intimate knowledge of the village paths. He approaches the home of the woman he desires, a house where the sliding wooden shutters are left deliberately unlatched by a sympathetic mother or an understanding sister. He enters in absolute silence, his hands reaching out through the pitch-black interior, feeling for the texture of the bedding, listening for the soft, steady rhythm of her breath. In the absolute darkness of these rustic rooms, language became unnecessary. The world outside, with its rigid class systems, its taxes, and its demands for filial piety, was completely shut out. There was only the warmth of skin against skin, the rough texture of hand-woven hemp sheets, and the quiet whispers exchanged in the safety of the night. It was a fragile, temporary freedom, for when the first gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky and the wild pheasants started to call from the hills, the young man had to vanish like a ghost, slipping back through the shutters and returning to his own fields before the village woke. If he stayed too long, if the sun found him still resting his head on a pillow, the illusion would shatter, and the heavy machinery of family honor and community judgment would come crashing down upon them. This nocturnal dance was a reminder of how fleeting happiness could be, a sharp, bittersweet joy that owed its intensity entirely to its impermanence. As you walk further down toward the harbor, the sound of a distant shamisen begins to float through the air, a sharp, percussive twang that slices through the damp night, followed by the low, haunting melody of a bamboo flute. The music is coming from a small, low-ceilinged tavern near the water's edge, its doorway covered by a split cotton curtain that flutters gently in the sea breeze. Peering inside, you see a collection of travelers, sailors, and local laborers sitting around a small charcoal brazier, their faces flushed red from cheap sweet-sake and the warmth of the fire. In these public spaces, a different kind of intimacy was forged, an intimacy of shared exhaustion and temporary escape. Here, people from different walks of life could sit side by side, their shoulders rubbing against one another in the crowded space, sharing stories of distant provinces, sea monsters, and the legendary beauties of the capital's pleasure districts. The boundaries that kept people apart during the day became porous under the influence of alcohol and song, and for a few hours, the cold reality of their lives was forgotten in the shared warmth of human company. It is in these moments that you notice the subtle humor and dry wit of the Edo people, a quality that served as a vital survival mechanism against the pressures of their daily lives. They called the world the Ukiyo, the floating world. Originally a Buddhist term used to describe the melancholy, fleeting nature of human existence, the common people of Edo flipped the meaning on its head. If the world was fleeting, if our lives were merely temporary illusions that could be snatched away by fire, earthquake, or the whim of a lord, then why not float? Why not live like a good bobbing down a fast-moving river, enjoying every wave, every drop of wine, and every passing moment of pleasure? This philosophy allowed them to look at their own hardships with a kind of detached, amused irony. They wrote short, satirical poems called senryu that poked fun at everything from corrupt officials to the absurdities of love. One such poem might describe a lover so blinded by passion that he walks straight into a stone wall, while another might joke about a husband who spends all his money on expensive gifts for a courtesan, only to return home to a wife who refuses to blacken her teeth for him. This wit was not cruel. It was a way of softening the sharp edges of life, a recognition that everyone was trapped in the same beautiful, tragic game. The night grows colder now, and a light, misty rain begins to fall, turning the dust of the paths into a sleek, reflective mirror. You can see the reflection of the tavern's lantern dancing in the puddles, a long, broken ribbon of red light that twists and bends with every ripple caused by the falling drops. You wrap your cloak tighter around your shoulders, feeling the dampness creeping into the wool, and listen to the sound of the rain hitting the tile roofs. It is a soft, comforting hiss, a sound that seems to wrap the entire port town in a giant, protective blanket of silence. In the Edo period, rain was often seen as a friend to lovers. It kept people indoors, canceled official gatherings, and provided the perfect excuse for staying wrapped up in a warm futon for just an hour longer. The poets of the time spoke of rain that brings people together, a meteorological blessing that forced a pause in the endless cycle of work and duty. In the grand scheme of history, these quiet moments along the coast might seem insignificant. They are not recorded in the official chronicles of the shogunate. They did not change the borders of provinces or decide the outcomes of great battles. But to the people living through them, these moments were everything. They were the small anchor points that kept them grounded in their own humanity, when everything else in their world was designed to tie them into nameless cogs in a massive, feudal machine. Whether it was through a scented letter, a midnight walk through the wet grass, or a shared cup of sake in a warm tavern, they found ways to say to one another, "I am hay, I am warm, and for this moment, at least, I am free." As we prepare to leave this quiet port and turn our eyes toward the great, bustling roads that lead to the capital, let the image of that flickering oil lamp stay with you. Let the sound of the rain on the tiles and the smell of the salt air linger in your mind. We are just beginning our long journey into the private heart of this vanished world. And there are many more paths to walk, many more shadows to explore, and many more secrets waiting to be whispered in the dark. Rest your mind now. Let your breathing follow the slow, steady rhythm of the tide against the old wooden pier. And listen as the past speaks to you, not in the thundering voice of emperors, but in the quiet, world-weary sigh of a historian who remembers the warmth of a fire on a cold, rainy night. Part 2. The Great Highway and the Shadows of the Post Towns. Let your breath sink down once more, down into that quiet, rhythmic space where the modern world dissolves into the mist. We leave the salt air of our small coastal port behind, turning our faces toward the interior of the country, toward the great artery that binds the shogunate together, the Tokaido Road. This is the Eastern Sea Highway, a massive, dirt-packed ribbon of earth that stretches for hundreds of miles over mountains, across wide, rushing rivers, and through deep, silent forests of ancient cedar trees. By day, this road is a theater of perpetual movement, a swirling vortex of humanity where the high and the low are forced into a strange, grinding proximity. You can see the grand processions of the daimyo lords, hundreds of samurai in matching indigo liveries, their heavy straw sandals kicking up clouds of fine, white dust that settles in the hair of the commoners bowing flat in the ditches. You see traveling actors carrying their wooden prop boxes on their backs, itinerant monks ringing small bronze bells, and sweat-slick palanquin bearers whose shoulders are calloused like tree bark from carrying the wealthy inside heavy, swinging wooden boxes. But as the sun begins to dip below the jagged ridge of the western mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the pines, the character of the highway undergoes a profound sea change. The grand authority of the state begins to fray around the edges, replaced by a quiet, collective exhaustion, and a desperate need for shelter, food, and a warm place to rest an aching body. You are walking along this road just as the dusk is deepening into a cool, mountain slate blue. The air here smells different from the coast. It is sharp and resinous, filled with the scent of green moss, damp fern fronds, and the dry, sweet smoke of burning pine knots from the post towns that lie spaced out at regular intervals along the route. These post towns, or shuku, are the true sanctuaries of the highway. Enclosed clusters of inns, stables, and tea houses that exist primarily to service the endless stream of travelers. As you approach the entrance of the town, you pass beneath a large, wooden gate where the official decrees of the shogun are posted on high boards, warning citizens against the smuggling of weapons, the movement of unauthorized women, and the dangers of gambling. But beneath these stern, public warnings, the town itself is humming with a far more intimate energy. The paper lanterns are being hung out on long bamboo poles in front of the inns, their large, painted characters glowing red and white through the rising evening mist, inviting the weary traveler to step off the hard earth of the highway and into a world where their social status can be temporarily set aside in exchange for a hot bath and a cup of warm, cloud-gray sake. Let us guide your steps toward one of the mid-sized inns, an establishment known as a Hatago, which caters to merchants, craftsmen, and the occasional samurai traveling without a grand retinue. As you step across the threshold, leaving your dusty straw sandals at the door on a long wooden rack, the physical reality of the road falls away. The floorboards beneath your bare feet are smooth and cool, polished to a mirror-like sheen by centuries of sliding feet and natural wood oils. The layout of these inns is an exercise in communal living, a maze of small, square rooms divided only by standard fusuma screens. Thin wooden frames covered in thick layers of decorative paper. These screens can be easily slid back to create a single, massive hall for a grand banquet, or closed to form tiny, box-like bedrooms for individual guests. But you must understand, these walls are purely visual barriers. They offer no protection against the human voice, the heavy sigh of a tired man stretching his back, or the rustle of clothing being peeled off a damp body. To stay in a post town and was to live in a house of whispers, an environment where intimacy was not something you found in total isolation, but something you managed within the hearing of 20 strangers. In the center of the inn's main room sits the Aurori, a large, square sunken hearth cut directly into the floorboards, filled with fine, gray wood ash and a crackling fire of split oak logs. Above it hangs a heavy bronze kettle, suspended from the ceiling by an intricate, adjustable wooden pulley shaped like a river fish. The water inside the kettle is always simmering, a low, steady hiss that provides the background music for the evening's conversations. Around this fire, travelers from every corner of the Japanese islands gather to thaw their stiff joints, their faces illuminated by the bright, orange dance of the flames, reveal the sheer diversity of the shogun's realm. Here sits a wealthy textile merchant from Osaka, his fingers smooth and white from handling fine silks, sharing a low wooden bench with a rugged packhorse driver from the northern mountains whose skin is burned to the color of an old chestnut. In the warmth of the hearth, the rigid etiquette of the daytime road begins to soften. Men and women who would never dare to speak to one another in the capital now exchange stories of their home provinces. Speaking of local festivals, legendary ghosts that haunt the mountain passes, and the varying prices of rice and salt, it is a fleeting, accidental intimacy, a crossing of paths that will last only until the morning temple bell rings, yet it provides a profound sense of comfort to those who are far from home. As the evening wears on, the guests are invited to visit the bathhouse, a separate, low-ceilinged structure at the back of the inn where the air is thick with a dense, billowing cloud of white steam that smells powerfully of fresh cedar and sulfur. The tub itself is a massive, deep box constructed from heavy planks of hinoki wood, a legendary timber that releases a rich, lemony fragrance when soaked in boiling water. In the Edo period, bathing was a highly social, communal ritual. There were no private stalls or hidden corners. Everyone stripped away their clothes, their weapons, and their social uniforms, entering the hot water together as equals in the flesh. As you sink into the near-boiling water, feeling the intense heat penetrate deep into your aching muscles, you listen to the low murmur of voices around you through the steam. In this misty twilight, the distinctions between the classes are completely dissolved. A samurai without his swords and topknot looks exactly like a carpenter, their bodies sharing the same scars of labor and time. The conversations in the bath are relaxed, spoken in low, rumbling tones that echo softly against the wet wooden walls. It is here that the true news of the empire is traded. Not the official proclamations of the court, but the rumors of political corruption in the capital, the whispers of secret love affairs between high-ranking court ladies and low-born actors, and the quiet grumblings of the common people against the endless taxes of the local lords. After the bath, you return to your room, your skin tingling from the heat and wrapped in a simple, loose-fitting cotton robe known as a yukata. The servants have already laid out your bedding. A thick, heavy futon filled with raw cotton that smells of the sun, resting directly upon the clean, pale green tatami mats. The room is small, lit only by a single oil lamp that casts a soft, amber glow against the paper walls. Through the thin partitions, you can hear the sounds of the settling down for the night. The slide of wooden shutters being locked along the outer verandas, the low, distant laughter of a group of merchants playing a final game of dice in a corner room, and the steady, rhythmic scrape of a night watchman's wooden clappers walking the dark alleys outside. It is in these quiet hours of the post town that a more secret, professional kind of intimacy takes place. The world of the Meshimoriana, or the rice-serving women. Officially, these women were hired by the innkeepers as simple maids, tasked with cooking meals, cleaning the heavy wooden corridors, and serving tea and sake to the guests. But the shogunate, in its infinite practicality, turned a blind eye to their true function. In reality, they were low-ranking courtesans, women who offered companionship, conversation, and physical warmth to the lonely travelers who could afford their modest fees. Many of these women were the daughters of poor farmers from the surrounding countryside, sold into service for a period of years to pay off a family debt or to save a younger brother from starvation. Their lives were governed by a grueling routine of hard labor by day and forced cheerfulness by night. And yet, within the narrow confines of their profession, they often developed a remarkable degree of emotional resilience and dry, cynical wisdom. Imagine one of these women entering your room in the late evening, carrying a small lacquer tray with a fresh flask of heated sake and 2 tiny, earthenware cups. Her movements are quiet, her long sleeves rustling like dry autumn leaves as she sits cross-legged on the tatami across from you. Her hair is styled in a simpler version of the capital's grand fashions, held together with plain wooden combs rather than expensive tortoiseshell. Her face is lightly powdered with white rice flour, her eyes dark and watchful in the dim lamplight. She does not possess the aloof, aristocratic elegance of the high-class courtesans of the capital's licensed districts. Her hands are rougher, showing the faint red marks of kitchen work in cold well water. But there is a warmth in her demeanor, an ease of speech that comes from having encountered thousands of different men from every corner of the world. As she pours your sake, her wrist moving in a practiced, elegant arc, she begins to talk. Her voice is soft, modulated to stay within the boundaries of your small room, ensuring that the guests on the other side of the paper screen cannot decipher her words. She does not ask about your business or your social standing. She asks about the road. She asks if the mud was deep in the mountain passes, if the mountain cherries are still blooming in the higher elevations, and if your feet are sore from the journey. This is a simulated intimacy, certainly, a service paid for with silver coins. But to the traveler who has spent weeks walking in silence through unfamiliar territories, surrounded by the cold indifference of nature and the rigid gaze of officialdom, this temporary warmth is a powerful medicine. For an hour or two, you are not merely a nameless traveler passing through a foreign province. You are a human being whose comfort matters to another. The relationship between a traveler and a Meshimoriana was by its very nature fleeting, a union engineered to last only until the dawn. The poets of the Edo period, who who were obsessed with the bittersweet nature of temporary things, wrote endlessly about these midnight encounters in the post towns. They described the sadness of the morning departure, when the faint, blue light of dawn would begin to seep through the cracks of the wooden shutters, illuminating the small, untidy pile of clothes on the floor and the sleeping form of the woman beside you. The traveler would have to dress in silence, tying his straw sandals back onto his feet while his body was still warm from the futon, knowing that he would likely never see this woman again. She would remain in the inn, welcoming another stranger the following night, while he would continue his long, solitary walk toward his destination. It was an intimacy built entirely upon the understanding of its own death, a realization that added a sharp, melancholic edge to every touch and every word spoken in the dark. Let us look closer at the dry wit that these women developed as a shield against the hardships of their lives. They knew exactly what they were to the men who rented their time. They were temporary escapes, human lanterns meant to burn bright for a night and be discarded in the morning. They had no illusions about romance or grand promises. When a traveler, swept up in the emotion of the moment, would promise to return for her, to buy out her contract and take her away to a grand house in the city, she would usually respond with a soft, teasing laugh or a sarcastic remark about the reliability of men's vows after 3 cups of sake. They knew that the road only moved in one direction, and that words spoken in an oil-lit room had a habit of evaporating the moment the traveler stepped back onto the dusty earth of the highway. This cynicism was not bitter. It was a form of honesty, a way of maintaining their own dignity in a system that treated their bodies as simple commodities. Outside the inn, the rain has stopped, and the mountain air has grown intensely cold. The wind howls through the deep valleys, rattling the heavy wooden shingles on the roofs of the post town and making the old cedar trees groan like ancient spirits. If you look through a small knothole in the wooden shutters of your room, you can see the empty expanse of the highway stretching out into the darkness. Completely deserted now, guarded only by the stone lanterns that stand at the edges of the town, their small, flickering wicks fighting against the drafts. In this cold, vast landscape, the inn feels like a tiny, fragile arc of human warmth floating on a dark, indifferent sea. Inside, the communal warmth persists. You can hear the deep, low snores of the sleepers in the next room, the occasional rustle of a futon as someone turns over in their sleep, and the quiet, comforting sound of the woodish settling in the main hearth down the hall. This was the rhythm of intimacy along the great road, a constant alternating current between absolute isolation and intense, unavoidable closeness. It taught the people of the Edo period to value the immediate moment above all else. When you are constantly on the move, when every town is merely a temporary stop and every person you meet is a stranger, you cannot afford to wait for the perfect conditions to find connection. You take it where you find it, in the steam of a shared bath, in the low murmur of a conversation around a winter fire, or in the paid-for smile of a rice-saving woman who understands your loneliness because she lives it every single day. These small, transient connections were the invisible mortar that held the human geography of the empire together, ensuring that the great highway was not just a path for commerce and military power, but a living, breathing line of human experience. As the lamp in your room begins to sputter, its oil running low and the wick blackening into a small, glowing ember, let yourself sink deeper into the heavy cotton of your bedding. Listen to the distant, lonely call of a mountain owl echoing through the valley, a sound that highlights the profound stillness that has settled over the post town. The road is waiting for you in the morning, with its dust, its checkpoints, and its endless miles of walking. But for now, you are safe within the wooden walls of the inn, wrapped in the warm shadows of a history that has long since passed away. Let your mind rest. Let the images of the glowing lanterns and the steaming baths fade into the dark, and prepare yourself for the long journey that lies ahead. For tomorrow, The road leads us closer to the great center of everything, the massive, swirling vortex of the capital city itself. Part 3. The gates of the capital and the paper walls of the suburbs. Let the heavy cadence of the road settle into the earth beneath you. As we leave the mountain passes and the cold winds of the high ridges behind, your steps are lighter now, though your limbs carry the deep, resonant ache of many days of travel. The air begins to change once more, losing the sharp, resinous scent of alpine pines and taking on a dense, complicated aroma that belongs only to the greatest gathering of souls in the world. It is the scent of Edo, the capital city, a massive, sprawling labyrinth of timber, tile, and humanity that sits at the edge of a wide, gray bay. Long before you even see the outer fringes of the city, you can smell it. A thick, unmistakable haze composed of tens of thousands of charcoal braziers cooking morning rice, the pungent, earthy smell of night soil being collected by farmers for the suburban fields, the sharp tang of fermenting soy sauce from the great storehouses, and the sweet, heavy scent of cedar sawdust from the endless construction sites that patch the wounds of the city's frequent fires. You are approaching the southern gate, the great checkpoint of Shinagawa, where the shogun's guards stand with long wooden pikes, their eyes sharp as hawks as they inspect the wooden travel passes of every man, woman, and child seeking entry into the beating heart of the empire. The sun is hanging low and white in a misty, sea-born sky, casting a flat, pearlescent light across the thatch and tile roofs that stretch out as far as the eye can see, like a vast, frozen sea of gray wood and clay. Hey, at the threshold of the capital, the sheer scale of human life is dizzying. You are no longer surrounded by the casual, accidental community of the highway. This is an empire of neighborhoods, a dense, tightly packed grid of commoner districts known as machi, where over 500,000 merchants, artisans, laborers, and scoundrels live stacked upon one another like boxes in a merchant's vault. The houses here are built with an almost desperate efficiency. Long, narrow tenements called nagaya, or longhouses, that run down the narrow side alleys away from the main ditches of the grand thoroughfares. These buildings are the true stage for the daily theater of Edo life. Structures made of thin pine uprights, split bamboo laths, and coarse gray plaster mixed with straw. A single longhouse might stretch for 100 feet down a muddy lane, divided internally into tiny, single-room units that measure no more than 9 feet wide by 12 feet deep. For a family of 4 or 5, or for a pair of young lovers starting their lives in the capital, this small square of tatami mats was their entire world. To live in an Edo Nagaya was to abandon any illusion of physical or auditory isolation. The walls between the units are nothing more than a single layer of plaster over bamboo, so thin that if your neighbor turns over in his sleep, you can hear the rough cotton of his bedding rustling against the mats. If a child cries 3 doors down, the sound vibrates through the entire structure like a finger striking a bronze bell. You can hear the steady, rhythmic chop of a kitchen knife preparing daikon radish next door, the low, grumbling argument of an old couple across the narrow hallway, and the quiet, breathless whispers of lovers trying to find a moment of peace in the middle of the afternoon. In this environment, intimacy had to adjust itself to the reality of the collective A. It became quiet, subterranean, and remarkably disciplined. People learned the art of speaking without voice, using the subtle shift of a shoulder, the soft pressure of a finger against a wrist, or the deliberate, slow closing of the eyes to convey meanings that could never be spoken aloud without inviting the amusement or the judgment of the entire alleyway. Let us guide your steps down one of these narrow, internal lanes, where the mud is slick and black from the kitchen slopes and the sky above is reduced to a narrow strip of gray silk between the overhanging eaves. You have to tilt your head to avoid the wet laundry hanging from long bamboo poles pushed out from the second-story windows. Long cotton loincloths and faded blue indigo aprons dripping steadily into the puddles below. At the back of the lane sits the communal well, the true heart and brain of the neighborhood. Hey, from the first light of dawn until the oil lamps are snuffed at night, the women of the longhouse gather to wash rice, rinse clothes, and scrub their iron kicking pots. The sound of the wooden bucket clattering down into the dark water, followed by the heavy, splashing slurp as it is hauled back up by a thick hemp rope, is the constant metronome of daily life. It is at the well that the public mind of the district is formed. It is a place of endless, rolling gossip, where every detail of every resident's life is weighed, dissected, and catalogued with a sharp, collective wit. They know exactly whose husband spent his night at a low-class archery parlor, whose daughter is receiving secret letters from a samurai's clerk, and whose rent is 3 months behind. For a young couple living in these crowded conditions, finding a space to be alone required immense ingenuity and a deep understanding of the city's rhythms. The domestic room offered no sanctuary during the day, for the sliding front door opened directly onto the alleyway, and neighbors felt entirely free to stick their heads in without knocking to borrow a pinch of salt or a glowing ember from the brazier. Therefore, intimacy often had to flee the home, seeking out the semi-private spaces that the city provided for those with a few copper coins to spare. One of the most popular refuges was the Dichaya, the Encounter Tea House, hidden away in the quiet, willow-fringed suburbs or along the winding canals of the entertainment districts. These tea houses were completely different from the bustling establishments that served the thirsty travelers along the main roads. From the outside, they looked intentionally plain, almost anonymous. Perhaps a simple wooden facade with a small indigo curtain hanging low over the entrance, revealing nothing of the interior to the casual passerby. But once you stepped inside, passing a discreet proprietor who bowed low without ever looking directly at your face, you were led down a maze of quiet, carpeted corridors to a private room at the back. These rooms were designed with a single purpose: to isolate two people from the rest of the world. The shoji screens were made of thick, opaque paper that blocked the view of the interior completely, and the windows opened onto tiny, enclosed pocket gardens where a single maple tree or a small stone basin filled with water created the illusion of being deep in a mountain forest, miles away from the roaring crowds of the capital. Inside the Encounter Tea House, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, suspended silence. The floor mats were always clean and fresh, releasing a cool, sweet aroma of dried grass that masked the dust of the city. A single silk futon would be laid out in the center of the room, its fabric cool and smooth against the skin. Hey, for a few hours, a clerk from a wealthy merchant house could meet the daughter of a sake brewer, or a samurai who had slipped away from his lord's mansion could discard his stiff silk crests and find warmth in the arms of a woman whose name he might never officially know. The intimacy found in these rooms was intense precisely because it was stolen. A temporary island of silence purchased in a city that never stopped talking. The clock in these tea houses was measured not by the temple bells, but by the slow burning down of a long, slender stick of incense placed in a ceramic holder in the corner. As the ash grew longer, curving down toward the table like a dying white worm, the lovers knew their time was trickling away, and that soon they would have to return to their separate, locked worlds. Let us look at the sensory details of these secret afternoons. The light in the room is soft, filtered through the paper screens until it takes on a warm, milky quality that irons out the lines of anxiety on a young face. You can hear the distant, hollow plop of a frog jumping into the stone water basin outside, and the faint, rhythmic creak of a water barge moving down the canal beyond the garden wall. The air smells of the dry incense smoke, a sweet, heavy blend of sandalwood and musk, and the faint, warm scent of hot tea cooling in 2 small porcelain cups. There is a profound melancholy in these encounters, an understanding that this room was a beautiful lie. Outside the paper walls, the great machine of the shogunate is still turning. The social classes are still absolute, and the futures of both individuals are already written in the ledgers of their families. This awareness made every gesture deliberate. The way a woman would slowly untie her narrow sash, letting the heavy silk fall to the floor with a soft, sliding whisper. Or the way a man would hold her hand, tracing the small lines on her palm with his thumb as if trying to memorize the texture of her skin before the incense burned out. But for those who could not afford the fees of the encounter tea houses, the city offered other, darker spaces. You could find them in the late evening along the banks of the Sumida River, where the great wooden span of the Ryogo Bridge arches over the water like the back of a giant dragon. By day, the bridge is the center of the city's popular culture. A carnival of acrobats, storytellers, fortune-tellers, and food stalls selling fresh sushi and deep-fried tempura to the milling crowds. But at night, after the stalls have closed and the great paper lanterns have been put out, the wide, sandy flats beneath the wooden pilings of the bridge become a world of shadows. Hey, in the cool, damp darkness where the river water laps against the grease-soaked wood of the piers, the low-class courtesans known as yotaka, or nighthawks, carried on their trade. These women were the ghosts of the capital's night, many of them older women who had aged out of the licensed districts, or runaway daughters from the provinces who had no other way to avoid the starvation of the winter months. They walked the dark river banks, carrying a rolled-up straw mat under their arm and a small paper lantern with a broken wick, their faces heavily painted with thick, white lead powder to hide the marks of smallpox or the deep lines of age and exhaustion. When a customer approached, perhaps a poor de labor with a few copper coins burning a hole in his indigo apron, she would lead him into the dark spaces beneath the bridge, unroll her mat upon the damp sand, and offer a brief, desperate mimicry of warmth. There was no poetry here, no scented letters, and no slow burning of incense. The intimacy of the Nighthawks was elemental, raw, and profoundly sad. It was an encounter between two lonelinesses, two people who had been discarded by the grand prosperity of the capital, finding a moment of physical contact beneath the very floorboards where the wealthy and the powerful walked during the day. You could hear the heavy thud of footsteps on the bridge planks high above their heads, the creak of the great beams as a late-night horse passed over, and the cold, wet wind blowing off the bay, carrying the smell of dead fish and rotting wood. And yet, even in these dark corners, there was a kind of communal understanding. The Nighthawks were known for their fierce loyalty to one another, sharing their meager earnings to buy medicine for a sick companion or to pay for proper burial for a sister who had died in the mud. It was an intimacy born of common misery, a recognition that they were all leaves floating down the same dark, indifferent river. As the midnight hour approaches, the great bells of the city's temples begin to swing, their deep, bronze voices booming out across the rooftops from Asakasa to Zojoji. The sound is a low, rolling thunder that passes through the paper walls of the longhouses and the thick timber gates of the mansions, a reminder to all citizens that the night is half spent and that the laws of the shogun are still awake. In the longhouse lanes, the night watchman walks his rounds, his wooden clappers striking together with a sharp, dry clack-clack. Clack-clack, a sound that tells the sleepers that the peace is being kept, that the fires are being watched, and that the world is as it should be. You lie awake on your thin futon, listening to that fading sound as it moves further down the alleyway, feeling the closeness of the bodies around you through the thin plaster walls. This was the true paradox of intimacy in the capital. You were never alone, yet you were constantly searching for space to be solitary. The city forced you into a perpetual embrace with your neighbors, sharing their smells, their voices, and their tragedies. Yet within that crowded canvas, the individual heart insisted on its own small plot of ground. Whether it was in the golden silence of an encounter tea house or the cold sand beneath the Ryoga Bridge, the people of Edo found their gaps. They carved out their tiny sanctuaries of leather and paper, proving that even in the middle of the most ordered city on earth, The private whisper could still rise above the roar of the crowd. Let your eyes grow heavy now, as the rain begins to patter softly against the wooden tiles above your head. A light, summer rain that washes the dust from the willow trees along the canals and turns the great river into a sheet of silver glass. The capital is sleeping, its 500,000 souls wrapped in their cotton robes, dreaming of the floating world. Rest your thoughts. Let the images of the longhouses and the secret gardens dissolve into the soft, gray dark of the evening, and let your breath follow the slow, steady rhythm of the city's quietest hour. For tomorrow, our path leads us even deeper into the labyrinth, away from the commoner lanes and toward the high, white walls of the samurai estates, where intimacy was guarded by iron laws and the sharp edge of the sword. Part 4. Behind the white walls and the honor of the samurai. Let your mind descend now into a deeper, colder silence, away from the crowded alleys of the longhouses and the warm, gossiping air of the communal wells. We cross the wide stone-lined moats of the inner city, where the water lily pads float like dinner plates upon the gray, still surface. And we enter the Yamanote, the high districts. This is the realm of the military nobility, the samurai, a world enclosed behind high, white-plastered walls that sit upon foundations of massive, interlocking stones. The paths here are wide, straight, and eerily quiet, paved with clean gravel that crunches with a dry, rhythmic hiss beneath your feet. There are no street vendors here, no laughing children running through the mud, and no sounds of musical instruments floating from tavern doors. The air smells of damp pine needles, polished lacquer, and the cold, metallic scent of iron and oil. Every mansion is a small fortress, its great wooden gates studded with iron bolts and guarded by silent men whose hands rest naturally on the wrapped hilts of their long swords. To step into this world is to enter an architecture of absolute restraint, where every gesture is measured by the yardstick of duty, and where intimacy is not a private luxury, but a matter of state, lineage, and the cold demands of family honor. You are standing in the inner courtyard of a mid-ranking samurai estate as the evening mist begins to roll in from the surrounding hills, wrapping the manicured pine trees in a pale, ghostly shroud. The houses here are large, built from dark, expensive cypress timber that has been rubbed with charcoal to protect it from the weather. The windows are covered by fine, tightly woven wooden lattices that let in the cool evening breeze but keep the interior completely hidden from the gaze of anyone walking across the courtyard. Inside, the rooms are spacious, sparse, and cold. The tatami mats are of the highest quality, bordered with dark, plain borders that show no individual flair. There are no crowded spaces here. Every object, from the low writing desk to the single hanging scroll in the alcove representing a mountain in winter, is placed with absolute precision. This spatial emptiness reflects the internal world of the samurai, a mind that was trained from childhood to be a void, a vessel that contained nothing but loyalty to the Lord and obedience to the ancestral line. In such an environment, the human heart was forced to become a secret, hidden beneath layers of formal silk robes and behind a face that was never allowed to reveal an individual emotion. For a woman born into a samurai family, intimacy was an experience framed entirely by the laws of obligation. She was not merely an individual, she was a link in a genetic chain that stretched back to the legendary warriors of the past and forward into an uncertain future. Her marriage was a political alliance, negotiated by family elders and approved by the clan officials to secure a fief, settle an old dispute, or demonstrate loyalty to a superior lord. When she left her father's house to enter the estate of her new husband, she did so in a closed, white palanquin that resembled a funeral box, a visual declaration that her old life was dead, and that her physical body now belonged entirely to the honor of her new home. Her teeth were blackened, her eyebrows shaved off and repainted as small, dark clouds high on her forehead. an ancient aristocratic fashion that effectively turned a face into an immobile, white mask. When she looked at her husband across the formal reception room, she did so through eyes that were trained to look down, her hands tucked neatly into the white sleeves of her heavy silk kimono. True connection between a samurai husband and wife did not begin with passion. It began with a shared understanding of their mutual sacrifice. They were both prisoners of the same rigid code. Imagine the late-night hours in one of these aristocratic bedrooms. The oil lamp is turned low, casting long, geometric shadows across the vast expanse of the tatami mats. There is no sound from the outside world except the steady, rhythmic scrape of the night watchman's iron staff striking the gravel paths of the estate. Chink, chink, a cold, metallic sound that reinforces the walls of their isolation. The husband and wife sit cross-legged on opposite sides of the small flame, drinking a final cup of thin green tea before retiring. They do not speak of love or of their private fears. They speak of the household accounts, the health of the family heir, or the upcoming ceremonies at the shogun's castle. And yet, within this extreme formality, a profound, unspoken intimacy could exist. It was an intimacy of alignment, a quiet, mutual recognition that they were both standing shoulder to shoulder against the cold indifference of the world, maintaining the honor of their house at the cost of their own personal desires. Let us look at the subtle language of this aristocratic closeness. A samurai wife would express her devotion not through words, but through the perfection of her domestic service. The way she would gently take her husband's long sword from his hands when he returned from the castle, holding the deadly blade with both hands as if it were a sleeping child, and placing it upon the lacquer stand in the alcove with a reverence that bordered on the religious. The way she would prepare his garments for the morning, ensuring that the stiff silk shoulders of his formal jacket were ironed flat with a hot stone, and that his family crests were perfectly aligned, without a single thread out of place. This was love expressed as order, an intimacy that hid itself within the flawless execution of duty. The husband, in turn, would show his regard by a subtle softening of his voice when they were alone in the inner rooms. A rare, slight smile that he would never permit himself to show in the presence of his vassals or his lord. These tiny fractures in the iron armor of their public personas were precious. Small, golden moments of human vulnerability that were all the more intense because they were so strictly rationed. But what of those situations where the human heart refused to bow to the family line? In the rigid social structure of the Edo period, a forbidden romance within the samurai class was not a private indiscretion, it was a capital crime. If a samurai fell in love with a woman from the merchant class, or if a young wife found comfort in the arms of a handsome young retainer from her father's estate, the consequences were absolute. The law of the shogunate gave the head of the household the right, and indeed, the obligation, to execute any members of his house who brought dishonor upon the name through unfaithfulness. If the lovers were discovered, their fate was the sword. Or worse, the forced suicide that allowed the family to preserve its land and its stipends at the expense of their lives. This reality gave rise to one of the most melancholy phenomena of the era, shinju, or the double love suicide. When two lovers found themselves trapped in a world that offered no legal or physical space for their connection, they would choose to leave the world together, believing that through death, they could break the bonds of the social classes and be reborn on the same lotus leaf in the Western paradise. The popular theater of the time, the puppet plays of Chikamatsu Monzaemon, were filled with these tragic stories, which the common people of Edo watched with tears streaming down their faces, finding in the deaths of these aristocratic lovers a profound expression of ultimate freedom. Imagine a young samurai and his lover slipping out of the estate gate in the middle of a winter night. The snow falling in large, silent flakes that quickly cover their footprints on the wide gravel path. They are dressed in matching white robes, the color of death, hidden beneath dark traveling cloaks. They move without lanterns, guiding their steps by the faint, silver glow of the snow itself. They make their way toward a quiet temple grove at the edge of the city, where the ancient cryptomeria trees stand like dark pillars against the white landscape. There, beneath the low-hanging branches of an old cedar, they pause. The wind is completely still. The world is wrapped in an absolute, suffocating silence that seems to isolate them from the entire human race. The intimacy of these final moments was terrifyingly pure. They had stripped away their families, their titles, their wealth, and their futures. There was nothing left but the raw, shivering reality of their two bodies. They would sit down together in the snow, their shoulders pressed tight against one another for warmth, sharing a final cup of sake from a small wooden flask. The brushstrokes they used to write their death poems were deliberate, their hands steady despite the freezing cold. For in this moment, they were finally the masters of their own destiny. They would look into each other's eyes without their masks. The wife's eyebrows missing, her teeth black, yet her gaze filled with a fierce, absolute devotion that no law could touch. Then, with a quick, practiced motion born of generations of military training, the husband would draw his short sword, and together they would step across the threshold into the dark. The next morning, the snow would continue to fall, filling the quiet grove and covering the white robes until they were completely invisible, indistinguishable from the rest of the winter landscape. The shogunate would erase their names from the official registers, their families would speak of them only in whispers as a cautionary tale, and the great machine of the state would continue to turn without a pause. But in the popular imagination of the city, they would become immortal. Their names sung by blind musicians in the crowded streets, their story turned into art that reminded everyone who lived behind the white walls that even the sharpest sword could not cut the invisible red thread that binds one human soul to another. Let us leave the cold silence of the samurai estates now, letting the gravel paths and the high plaster walls fade into the midnight mist. We return to the inner rooms of our own quiet journey, listening to the soft, rhythmic breath of the night as it settles over the city. The great lords and the proud warriors are sleeping, their swords resting on their lacquer stands, their hearts hidden away in the dark. Rest your thoughts. Let the images of the snow and the white robes dissolve into the gentle warmth of your own rest. And let your breath follow the slow, steady rise and fall of a world that has found its peace. For in our next part, the sun will rise upon a different kind of sanctuary, the floating world of the licensed pleasure districts, where intimacy was turned into an art form, a business, and a beautiful, fleeting illusion. Part 5. The Nightless City and the Architecture of Illusion. Let the cold, gravel paths of the samurai estate slip from your mind, for we are moving now toward a destination that exists in a dimension entirely of its own. A walled-in paradise that the world calls the Yoshiwara, the Nightless City. Imagine, if you will, the sudden transition as you approach the massive, iron-reinforced omen gate that serves as the only entrance to this enclosed territory. Outside, the rest of Edo is dark, silent, and bound by the strict curfew of the shogunate, the only light provided by the occasional, lonely moon or the distant, flickering wick of a night watchman's lantern. But as you pass through that gate, the darkness is instantly, violently shattered. You are bathed in a sea of red, orange, and gold light, provided by thousands of paper lanterns hung in dense, suffocating clusters along the main thoroughfare, the Nakanocho. The air here is not the cold, metallic scent of the samurai districts, but a thick, intoxicating perfume of expensive incense, whale oil smoke, powdered rice, and the sweet, lingering musk of damp silk. It is a place designed to make you forget the passage of time, to make you forget your name, your rank, and the heavy, dusty reality of the road that brought you here. This district was an island, literally and metaphorically, surrounded by a deep, water-filled moat that kept the floating world distinct from the heavy, terrestrial order of the city. Inside these walls, the natural laws of Edo society were suspended, or at the very least, rewritten. For Hei, beauty was not a virtue of character, but a commodity to be curated, managed, and displayed like a rare, exotic flower in a conservatory. As you walk down the main street, your feet sink into a layer of fine, raked sand, kept meticulously clean by a small army of sweepers who move like ghosts in the periphery of your vision. You are surrounded by buildings of impossible elegance, inns and tea houses that are 3 or 4 stories tall, their facades covered in intricate latticework in dark, polished cedar. From behind these screens, the sound of shamisen music spills out into the night. A sharp, percussive, and intensely melodic sound that seems to vibrate in the very marrow of your bones, punctuated by the soft, rhythmical click of wooden handclappers and the high, haunting melody of a bamboo flute. Let us focus our attention on the hierarchy of this world. For this was not a place of chaotic, unmanaged desire, but a strictly disciplined environment where every movement, every gesture, and every word was governed by a centuries-old code of etiquette. At the pinnacle of this world lived the Oiran, the high-ranking courtesans who were the stars of this floating stage. To witness an Oiran's procession, Hadochu, as she made her way from her house to the tea house where her client awaited, was to witness a performance of absolute artifice. She would emerge from the shadows of her house, dressed in layers of silk kimonos so heavy that she could not walk normally. Instead, she moved with a rhythmic, sweeping step, the toe of her high, lacquered wooden clog describing a slow, elegant arc in the sand. Her hair was not simply styled. It was a sculpture, piled high and adorned with dozens of heavy tortoiseshell combs and shimmering gold pins that caught the lantern light and threw it back into the eyes of the onlookers. Her face was a white mask, a blank canvas upon which the beauty of the Edo era was painted, a deliberate erasing of the human to make room for the ideal. Behind her walked her retinue, the young Komuro, little girls in training who were dressed in miniature, ornate versions of the Oiran's attire, their faces painted with the same white powder, their eyes wide and watchful. They carried the Oiran smoking set, her spare fans, and the decorative tissues she might need to wipe a spot of rouge from her lip. This was a choreography of power, a visual manifestation of the wealth and prestige of the house that owned her. And yet, behind this spectacle, there was the profound, world-weary reality of the lives led within these walls. The Oiran were not merely beautiful objects. They were highly educated artists who had been trained from childhood in the difficult, exacting arts of conversation, poetry, calligraphy, and music. A man who paid to spend an evening in their company was not just paying for a body. He was paying for the privilege of a conversation that could traverse the landscape of classical literature, the subtle nuances of the tea ceremony, and the sharp, ironic humor of the senryu poetry that satirized the very world they inhabited. This was the secret of the floating world, the irony of the Ukiyo. The residents of the Yoshiwara understood better than anyone that their existence was a temporary, artificial construct. They knew that the beauty they curated, the luxury they displayed, and the pleasures they offered were all inherently fleeting. And that is precisely why they valued them so intensely. When you sit in a room in the Yoshiwara, the walls are not the thin, shaky plaster of a suburban longhouse. They are covered in exquisite murals of golden clouds, rolling hills, and mythical creatures, painted by the best artists of the capital. The air is scented with rare garwood imported from the southern islands, a smell that is designed to transport you away from the gray, damp reality of your daily life. You are sitting on a cushion of the finest silk, drinking sake from a cup of handcrafted porcelain that is thin as an eggshell. And as the night stretches on, the artificiality of the environment becomes its own kind of truth. You realize that this is not a lie. It is a dream, and like all dreams, it is all the more beautiful because it is destined to vanish with the rising of the sun. There's a dry, poignant wit to this place. A recognition that the game is rigged, yet everyone chooses to play anyway. The merchants who flock here, spending months of their income in a single night of revelry, know perfectly well that they are being fleeced by the house owners. The courtesans, who are technically bonded servants with no freedom of movement, know that their lives are being sold off piece by piece to keep the district running. And yet, in the space of the room, when the lamp is lit and the conversation flows, there's a genuine, human connection that blossoms between them. It is a connection of mutual recognition, a shared understanding of the burden of being alive in a world that demands so much and gives so little. They look at each other and they see the same exhaustion, the same hunger for beauty, and the same desperate desire to feel, for just a few hours, like they are the masters of their own destiny. Consider the small, intimate details of these late-night encounters. The way a courtesan might reach out, her long, flowing sleeve catching the edge of the lamp, and gently, with a grace born of 1,000 nights of repetition, pour a fresh cup of warmth's sake for her guest. Her hand might brush his knee for a fraction of a second. A touch that is scripted, yes, and paid for, yes, but which carries a warmth that can still penetrate the numbness of a traveler who has spent years walking the hard, dusty roads of the empire. She might whisper a line of verse about the impermanence of cherry blossoms, a reminder that all things, the youth of the courtesan, the wealth of the merchant, and the life of the shogun himself, are merely dust on the wind. And then she might laugh, a soft, musical, and utterly insincere sound that nevertheless leaves a trace of genuine melody in the air. The hierarchy of this place extends even to the atmosphere of the rooms. There are rooms for the elite, where the light is soft, the music is distant, and the privacy is absolute. And there are rooms for the commoners, where the air is thick with the smell of sweat and cheap tobacco, and the laughter is loud and unfiltered. But even in the lower-tier houses, the architecture of the illusion remains the same. They too are decorated with lanterns, they too are filled with the sound of the shamisen, and they too offer the same promise of a temporary escape from the gravity of the outside world. This was the genius of the Yoshiwara. It was a democratic fantasy. It provided a version of the same dream for everyone, from the low-level clerk who saved his copper coins for a year to the high-ranking official who spent his family's gold in an afternoon. As you wander further into the district, past the quiet houses where the senior courtesans are resting, you come upon the back alleys, the service lanes where the reality of the Yoshiwara makes itself known. Hey, the magic begins to fray. You see the young Komuro scrubbing the floors, their tiny hands red and chapped from the cold water. You see the kitchen servants holding heavy crates of vegetables and charcoal, their backs bent, their faces tight with the fatigue of a 16-hour day. You see the reality of the industry that sustains the beauty, the massive, unseen labor that goes into maintaining the illusion of the floating world. This is the skeleton beneath the silk, and it is just as essential to the truth of the Yoshiwara as the golden screens and the shimmering kimonos. Do not turn away from this, for this is the history of the human heart. It is the story of how we build cathedrals of light to hide the darkness of our own condition. It is the story of how we take the pain of our existence and turn it into art, into music, into poetry, and into the careful, precise rituals of an encounter. The people of the Edo period were not trying to escape reality. They were trying to elevate it. They were trying to create a space where the crushing weight of their social, economic, and political lives could be momentarily balanced by the lightness of a song, the scent of an incense, or the touch of a hand in the dark. The night is deep now. The hour of the ox is approaching, and the clamor of the district has begun to subside into a low, buzzing hum. The lanterns are starting to burn down, their red paper casings scorched and brown near the wicks. The musicians are tired, their fingers aching, their instruments being carefully wiped down and placed in their protective boxes. The courtesans are retiring, shedding their heavy, ornate costumes and letting their hair down, their faces scrubbed clean of the white powder, their bodies finally allowed to simply be bodies. In these quiet, late hours, the Yoshiwara is at its most human. The performance has ended, the audience has gone home, and the actors are just people, sitting around a small brazier, sharing a simple meal of rice and pickles, talking about the weather, or their hometowns, or the ache in their joints. This is the true intimacy of the district. Not the glittering display of the docho, not the expensive rituals of the tea houses, but the quiet, communal exhaustion of people who have spent their entire day carrying the weight of other people's fantasies. They understand each other in a way that no one on the outside ever could. They are the keepers of the night, the stewards of the dream. And as they sit there, in the dim, fading light of the dying embers, they share a kind of solidarity that is far stronger and more real than any of the promises they made to the customers during the day. Let your own mind find that same quiet state of release. As the energy of the Yoshiwara fades from your senses, let the image of the flickering lanterns, the swaying silk of the courtesans, and the mournful, beautiful sound of the shamisen drift away into the mist. You are safe. You are here, in the quiet inner room of our journey, and the night is yours to inhabit. We have walked through the gates, we have witnessed the spectacle, and we have peered behind the curtain to see the humanity that sustains it. But there is more to explore. For beyond the walls of the pleasure districts, beyond the gates of the capital, there are still the temples, the mountain shrines, and the quiet, lonely hermitages where a different kind of silence waits for us. But that is for later. For now, just breathe. Feel the weight of the air. Listen to the soft, rhythmic ticking of the night watchman's clappers, now fading into the distance, leaving only the sound of your own, slow, steady breath. The floating world is a beautiful illusion. But the truth of it, the truth of the connection, the warmth, and the shared human experience, that is what remains, long after the lanterns have burned out and the dawn has turned the gray city into a world of concrete and clay. Rest now. Let the tension drain from your shoulders. Let the images of the nightless city dissolve into a soft, monochromatic haze. And prepare yourself for the silence that comes with the morning. For even in the busiest city on earth, even in the heart of the floating world, the sun eventually rises, and the world begins again, in its own slow and mysterious way. Part 6. The Secret Garden and the Sanctuary of the Shrines. Let the vibrant, smoke-scented air of the nightless city melt away from your thoughts. Like mist dispersing under the quiet, steady pressure of a morning breeze. We move out from the iron gates of the Yoshiwara, turning away from the crowded riverbanks and the bustling thoroughfares of the commoners, and we climb into the low, green hills that encircle the northern edge of the capital. This is the world of the temples and the ancient mountain shrines, a landscape where the cedar trees stand tall, thick, and dark against the gray morning sky, their roots gripping the mossy earth like the fingers of old titans. The air here is completely different. It is cool, clean, and sharp, filled with the clean scent of wet loam, decaying leaves, the slight, bitter tang of green ferns, and the distant, clean fragrance of incense drifting from a monastic hall. There are no wooden clappers here, no clanging samurai swords, and no sharp twangs of the shamisen. The only sounds of the deep, rhythmic sighing of the wind through the high canopy of the pines, the hollow plop of a single drop of water falling into a stone basin, and the clear, silver song of a mountain thrush echoing through the empty valleys. You are stepping onto a path of worn, gray stones. Steps that have been hollowed out in the center by the passage of millions of straw sandals over hundreds of years. A path that leads away from the laws of men and into the quiet sanctuary of the spirit. As you walk higher into the hills, the great city below begins to shrink, turning into a flat, gray patchwork of roofs hidden beneath a low blanket of morning fog. Hey, the architecture of restraint takes on a spiritual dimension. The shrines are not grand or ostentatious. They are built of unpainted cedar and cypress wood that has weathered over the decades into a soft, silvery gray that blends perfectly with the trunks of the surrounding trees. The roofs are thick, heavy thatch, green with moss and small ferns that have taken root in the damp straw. There are no walls here to shut people out. The sacred spaces are defined merely by a series of torii gates. Simple, elegant wooden structures consisting of 2 upright posts and 2 horizontal beams, painted a dull, faded vermilion that seems to glow with a quiet, inner heat against the dark green of the forest. To pass beneath one of these gates is to cross an invisible threshold, to step out of the realm of social class, obligation, and family contracts, and to enter a space where the individual soul is permitted to stand naked before the ancient forces of nature. In the Edo period, these temple groves and shrine grounds served a vital, hidden purpose in the human geography of the capital. They were the ultimate public sanctuaries, places where the rigid rules of the shogunate were officially suspended. The law of the city stated that within the boundaries of a sacred grove, the authorities could not make arrests without the explicit permission of the high priest, and the social classes were expected to mingle without hierarchy. Here, a wealthy merchant could sit on the same mossy stone bench as a poor laborer, sharing the shade of a 1,000-year-old ginkgo tree, and a samurai would lower his head in respect to an old peasant woman who was tying a paper fortune to a bamboo twig. This democratic spiritualism made the shrines the perfect refuge for those seeking a different kind of human connection, an intimacy that was not based on commerce, or duty, or law, but on a shared vulnerability before the vast, mysterious universe. Let us guide your steps down a small, hidden path that branches off from the main temple courtyard, leading deep into a secluded pocket garden tucked behind the priest's quarters. This is a place where the human hand has worked in perfect harmony with nature to create an illusion of absolute isolation. The path is made of irregular river stones, laid out in a winding, deliberate pattern that forces you to slow down your steps, to look down at your feet, and to become fully aware of every movement of your body. You pass through a low bamboo gate, its latch tied with a simple knot of hemp rope, and you find yourself in a tiny world of green and gray. There are no bright flowers here, no chaotic displays of color. The beauty of this garden is found entirely in the subtle variations of texture and shade. The rough, gray bark of an old plum tree, the soft, velvety cushion of green moss covering a stone lantern, and the clear, dark surface of a tiny pond where a single crimson carp moves like a slow flame beneath the lily pads. Inside this secret garden, the silence is so profound that you can hear the soft, sliding sound of your own clothing against your skin as you move. It is a space designed for 2 people to dissipate. In the Edo period, these quiet temple gardens were frequently used by lovers who had no other place to meet. Couples whose relationship was forbidden by their families or by the laws of their classes. Imagine a young clerk from a silk shop and the daughter of a low-ranking artisan meeting here in the late afternoon, when the sun is low and red behind the bamboo groves, casting long, barred shadows of gold and black across the moss. They sit together on a single, long wooden bench that has been darkened by years of summer rain. They do not touch it first. They simply sit in the quiet, watching the water ripples in the small pond, their shoulders separated by an inch of cool air. The intimacy found in this sacred space was quiet, contemplative, and deeply spiritual. It was an intimacy of shared silence. In a city where every word was overheard and every action was judged, to find a place where you could simply sit with another person without speaking, without pretending, and without looking over your shoulder was a profound relief. They would listen together to the slow, hollow thunk of a shishodoshi, a simple bamboo water pipe that slowly fills with water from a mountain spring until it tips over, strikes a stone with a dry, wooden clack, and empties itself, only to begin the cycle again. This sound, repeating at regular intervals every few minutes, did not shatter the silence. It highlighted it. It measured out the slow, precious minutes of their time together, a reminder that the world outside was still moving, but that for this moment, they were safely caught in the gaps of the clock. Let us look at the sensory world of this afternoon's sanctuary. The light is green and gold, filtered through the thick canopy of maple leaves until it takes on a cool, underwater quality that makes everything seem ancient and still. You can smell the sharp, clean aroma of the cedar needles drying on the ground, mixed with the deep, earthy scent of the moss and the faint, sweet trace of incense smoke drifting from the main altar across the valley. There is no urgency here, no demand for performance. A hand reaches out, a slow, deliberate movement, and fingers close gently around a wrist. The touch is cool, clean, and steady. A physical confirmation that they are both real, that they are both alive, and that they are sharing the same fragile sanctuary. They might whisper a few words, spoken in tones so low they do not even disturb the insects buzzing over the pond, speaking not of grand futures or impossible escapes, but of the beauty of the leaves, the clarity of the water, and the simple comfort of being together in the dark. This was the true power of the shrines. They provided an emotional decompression chamber for society that was under constant, intense pressure. The common people of Edo were deeply religious, but their faith was not a matter of fear or cold dogma. It was a living, breathing relationship with the kami, the spirits that inhabited every tree, every rock, every river, and every human heart. They believed that the spirits understood human weakness, that they looked upon the desires, the loves, and the secret sorrows of the common people with a kind of benevolent, amused tolerance. Therefore, to bring a forbidden love into the presence of the shrine was not considered sacrilege. It was seen as a way of placing that love under the protection of a higher, kinder law than the decrees of the shogun. Consider the small, dry wit that the people brought to their devotions. At many of these mountain shrines, there were special boards where people could hang small wooden plaques called upon which they wrote their prayers to the spirits. Alongside the prayers for good health, successful business, and safety from fires, you could find thousands of plaques dedicated to the matters of the heart. A young man might write a humorous, self-deprecating verse asking the kami to make a certain courtesan look upon him with favor even though his pockets were empty, while a young woman might ask the spirits to turn the eyes of her husband away from the archery parlors and back to his own hearth. They treated the gods like old, wise neighbors, people who had seen everything, who knew the absurdity of human nature, and who could be trusted to keep a secret. As the sun begins to sink behind the ridge of the hills, the shadows in the secret garden lengthen, turning the vibrant greens into deep, velvety blacks and cool grays. The crimson carp vanishes into the dark water of the pond, and the first evening bats begin to flutter through the bamboo stalks like small, jagged leaves caught in a draught. It is time for the lovers to leave. They stand up from the bench, their bodies stiff from the evening chill, and they spend a final moment smoothing down each other's clothes, ensuring that no stray leaf or bit of green moss remains on their kimonos to betray their afternoon whereabouts to the sharp eyes of the longhouse neighbors. They walk back down the stone steps together until they reach the main torii gate. And there, without a word, they separate. One walking down the eastern path toward the merchant districts, the other taking the western trail toward the suburbs. They return to the great machine of the city, but they carry the silence of the garden within them, like a small, cool stone tucked into the pocket of their robes. They have been washed by the green light, they have been measured by the bamboo pipe, and they have been validated by the presence of the ancient trees. This inner stillness was their true armor, a private sanctuary that no official could search and no law could confiscate. Let your own mind find that same deep, hill-born peace. As we prepare to descend back into the valleys of the capital, listen to the distant, deep boom of the great temple bell as it sounds the evening hour. A rolling, bronze wave of sound that travels through the trees, crosses the river, and settles over the thousands of roofs below. The spirits of the hills are staying behind, wrapped in their moss and their silence. But we carry their warmth with us. Rest your thoughts now. Let the image of the secret garden and the stone steps dissolve into the soft, comforting dark of your own rest. And let your breath follow the slow, steady rhythm of the mountain wind as it cradles the city in its sleep. For tomorrow, our journey brings us to the final, quietest space of all. The deep midnight of the household, where the dawn is waiting to wake the world once more. Part 6. The secret garden and the sanctuary of the shrines. Let the vibrant, smoke-scented air of the nightless city melt away from your thoughts. Like mist dispersing under the quiet, steady pressure of a morning breeze. We move out from the iron gates of the Yoshiwara, turning away from the crowded riverbanks and the bustling thoroughfares of the commoners. And we climb into the low green hills that encircle the northern edge of the capital. This is the world of the temples and the ancient mountain shrines. A landscape where the cedar trees stand tall, thick, and dark against the gray morning sky, their roots gripping the mossy earth like the fingers of old titans. The air here is completely different. It is cool, clean, and sharp, filled with the clean scent of wet loam, decaying leaves, the slight, bitter tang of green ferns, and the distant, clean fragrance of incense drifting from a monastic hall. There are no wooden clappers here, no clanging samurai swords, and no sharp twangs of the shamisen. The only sounds are the deep, rhythmic sighing of the wind through the high canopy of the pines, the hollow plop of a single drop of water falling into a stone basin, and the clear, silver song of a mountain thrush echoing through the empty valleys. You are stepping onto a path of worn, gray stones. Steps that have been hollowed out in the center by the passage of millions of straw sandals over hundreds of years. A path that leads away from the laws of men and into the quiet sanctuary of the spirit. As you walk higher into the hills, the great city below begins to shrink, turning into a flat, gray patchwork of roofs hidden beneath a low blanket of morning fog. Hey! The architecture of restraint takes on a spiritual dimension. The shrines are not grand or ostentatious. They are built of unpainted cedar and cypress wood that has weathered over the decades into a soft, silvery gray that blends perfectly with the trunks of the surrounding trees. The roofs are thick, heavy thatch, green with moss and small ferns that have taken root in the damp straw. There are no walls here to shut people out. The sacred spaces are defined merely by a series of torii gates. Simple, elegant wooden structures consisting of 2 upright posts and 2 horizontal beams, painted a dull, faded vermilion that seems to glow with a quiet, inner heat against the dark green of the forest. To pass beneath one of these gates is to cross an invisible threshold, to step out of the realm of social class, obligation, and family contracts, and to enter a space where the individual soul is permitted to stand naked before the ancient forces of nature. In the Edo period, these temple groves and shrine grounds served a vital, hidden purpose in the human geography of the capital. They were the ultimate public sanctuaries, places where the rigid rules of the shogunate were officially suspended. The law of the city stated that within the boundaries of a sacred grove, the authorities could not make arrests without the explicit permission of the high priest, and the social classes were expected to mingle without hierarchy. Here, a wealthy merchant could sit on the same mossy stone bench as a poor laborer, sharing the shade of a 1,000-year-old ginkgo tree, and a samurai would lower his head in respect to an old peasant woman who was tying a paper fortune to a bamboo twig. This democratic spiritualism made the shrines the perfect refuge for those seeking a different kind of human connection. An intimacy that was not based on commerce, or duty, or law, but on a shared vulnerability before the vast, mysterious universe. Let us guide your steps down a small, hidden path that branches off from the main temple courtyard, leading deep into a secluded pocket garden tucked behind the priest's quarters. This is a place where the human hand has worked in perfect harmony with nature to create an illusion of absolute isolation. The path is made of irregular river stones, laid out in a winding, deliberate pattern that forces you to slow down your steps, to look down at your feet, and to become fully aware of every movement of your body. You pass through a low bamboo gate, its latch tied with a simple knot of hemp rope, and you find yourself in a tiny world of green and gray. There are no bright flowers here, no chaotic displays of color. The beauty of this garden is found entirely in the subtle variations of texture and shade. The rough, gray bark of an old plum tree, the soft, velvety cushion of green moss covering a stone lantern, and the clay, dark surface of a tiny pond where a single crimson carp moves like a slow flame beneath the lily pads. Inside this secret garden, the silence is so profound that you can hear the soft, sliding sound of your own clothing against your skin as you move. It is a space designed for two people to dissipate. In the Edo period, these quiet temple gardens were frequently used by lovers who had no other place to meet. Couples whose relationship was forbidden by their families or by the laws of their classes. Imagine a young clerk from a silk shop and the daughter of a low-ranking artisan meeting here in the late afternoon, when the sun is low and red behind the bamboo groves, casting long, barred shadows of gold and black across the moss. They sit together on a single, long wooden bench that has been darkened by years of summer rain. They do not touch at first. They simply sit in the quiet, watching the water ripples in the small pond, their shoulders separated by an inch of cool air. The intimacy found in this sacred space was quiet, contemplative, and deeply spiritual. It was an intimacy of shared silence. In a city where every word was overheard and every action was judged, to find a place where you could simply sit with another person without speaking, without pretending, and without looking over your shoulder was a profound relief. They would listen together to the slow, hollow thunk of a shishodoshi, a simple bamboo water pipe that slowly fills with water from a mountain spring until it tips over, strikes a stone with a dry, wooden clack, and empties itself, only to begin the cycle again. This sound, repeating at regular intervals every few minutes, did not shatter the silence. It highlighted it. It measured out the slow, precious minutes of their time together, a reminder that the world outside was still moving, but that for this moment, they were safely caught in the gaps of the clock. Let us look at the sensory world of this afternoon's sanctuary. The light is green and gold, filtered through the thick canopy of maple leaves until it takes on a cool, underwater quality that makes everything seem ancient and still. You can smell the sharp, clean aroma of the cedar needles drying on the ground, mixed with the deep, earthy scent of the moss and the faint, sweet trace of incense smoke drifting from the main altar across the valley. There is no urgency here, no demand for performance. A hand reaches out, a slow, deliberate movement, and fingers close gently around a wrist. The touch is cool, clean, and steady. A physical confirmation that they are both real, that they are both alive, and that they are sharing the same fragile sanctuary. They might whisper a few words, spoken in tones so low they do not even disturb the insects buzzing over the pond. Speaking not of grand futures or impossible escapes, but of the beauty of the leaves, the clarity of the water, and the simple comfort of being together in the dark. This was the true power of the shrines. They provided an emotional decompression chamber for a society that was under constant, intense pressure. The common people of Edo were deeply religious, but their faith was not a matter of fear or cold dogma. It was a living, breathing relationship with the kami, the spirits that inhabited every tree, every rock, every river, and every human heart. They believed that the spirits understood human weakness, that they looked upon the desires, the loves, and the secret sorrows of the common people with a kind of benevolent, amused tolerance. Therefore, to bring a forbidden love into the presence of the shrine was not considered sacrilege. It was seen as a way of placing that love under the protection of a higher, kinder law than the decrees of the shogun. Consider the small, dry wood that the people brought to their devotions. At many of these mountain shrines, there were special boards where people could hang small wooden plaques called emma, upon which they wrote their prayers to the spirits. Alongside the prayers for good health, successful business, and safety from fires, you could find thousands of plaques dedicated to the matters of the heart. A young man might write a humorous, self-deprecating verse asking the kami to make a certain courtesan look upon him with favor even though his pockets were empty, while a young woman might ask the spirits to turn the eyes of her husband away from the archery parlors and back to his own hearth. They treated the gods like old, wise neighbors, people who had seen everything, who knew the absurdity of human nature, and who could be trusted to keep a secret. As the sun begins to sink behind the ridge of the hills, the shadows in the secret garden lengthen, turning the vibrant greens into deep, velvety blacks and cool grays. The crimson carp vanishes into the dark water of the pond, and the first evening bats begin to flutter through the bamboo stalks like small, jagged leaves caught in a draught. It is time for the lovers to leave. They stand up from the bench, their bodies stiff from the evening chill, and they spend a final moment smoothing down each other's clothes, ensuring that no stray leaf or bit of green moss remains on their kimonos to betray their afternoon whereabouts to the sharp eyes of the longhouse neighbors. They walk back down the stone steps together until they reach the main torii gate. And there, without a word, they separate. One walking down the eastern path toward the merchant districts, the other taking the western trail toward the suburbs. They return to the great machine of the city, but they carry the silence of the garden within them, like a small, cool stone tucked into the pocket of their robes. They have been washed by the green light, they have been measured by the bamboo pipe, and they have been validated by the presence of the ancient trees. This inner stillness was their true armor, a private sanctuary that no official could search and no law could confiscate. Let your own mind find that same deep, hill-born peace. As we prepare to descend back into the valleys of the capital, listen to the distant, deep boom of the great temple bell as it sounds the evening hour. A rolling, bronze wave of sound that travels through the trees, crosses the river, and settles over the thousands of roofs below. The spirits of the hills are staying behind, wrapped in the moss and their silence. But we carry their warmth with us. Rest your thoughts now. Let the image of the secret garden and the stone steps dissolve into the soft, comforting dark of your own rest. And let your breath follow the slow, steady rhythm of the mountain wind as it cradles the city in its sleep. For tomorrow, our journey brings us to the final, quietest space of all. The deep midnight of the household, where the dawn is waiting to wake the world once more. Part 7. The shadows of the warehouse districts and the flow of the canals. Let your consciousness float down from the green, silent hills of the shrines, leaving the whisper of the mountain cedars behind, and drift back toward the silver veins of the capital. The intricate network of canals that cuts through the merchant heart of Edo like the lines on an old sailor's palm. We find ourselves in the late night hours along the Nihonbashi River, the grand commercial axis where the wealth of an empire is brought to shore. By day, this water is a churning highway of wooden barges, bamboo rafts, and small, flat-bottomed boats called chokibun that dart through the traffic like water striders. The air then is a raucous din of shouting fishmongers, the heavy thud of rice bales being dropped onto wooden platforms, and the sharp, salty smell of dried bonito flakes and fermenting bean paste. But now, in the deep mid-hours of the night, the great commercial dance has stopped. The massive, white-walled storehouses, the Cure, stand side by side along the stone embankments like silent, square guards dressed in heavy armor. Their thick, fireproof shutters are locked tight with iron bars, and their smooth plaster surfaces reflect the cold, watery moonlight, casting long, stark shadows across the dark surface of the canal. The air here is cool and heavy with moisture, smelling of wet river silt, old hemp ropes soaking in the brine, the deep woody fragrance of cedar logs floating in the timber ponds, and the faint, sulphurous tang of the tide moving in from the bay. You are standing on a wooden landing stage that projects out over the black, glassy water. Listen, and you can hear the slow, rhythmic lap-lap of the river against the green slime of the stone walls. A steady, liquid pulse that feels like the very breathing of the city in its sleep. The grand, arched timber span of the Nyanbeshi Bridge rises into the dark nearby, completely empty of the thousands of feet that cross it during the sunlit hours. In this profound stillness, the canals become a different kind of world. An underworld of water and wood where the official boundaries of the land are softened by the shadows. In the Edo period, the water was often the only place where true freedom of movement existed. While the streets were blocked by heavy wooden gates that were locked at the stroke of the evening bell, the canals remained open. A fluid labyrinth where a boat could glide silently beneath the bridges, carrying its passengers across the city without ever coming under the gaze of the street watchman. This made the river the natural territory of the midnight encounter, a sanctuary for those whose private lives required the protection of the dark and the absolute discretion of the moving tide. Let us guide your steps onto the narrow deck of a chokibun, a small, elegant water taxi built of clean, unpainted cypress wood, its bow tapering to a sharp, delicate point that cuts through the water without a sound. The boatman stands at the stern, a silent silhouette wrapped in a dark indigo cloak, his hands gripping the long, curved wooden oar that projects into the water. He does not use a lantern. He knows the geography of the river by the shapes of the bridges and the scent of the storehouses. He moves the oar with a slow, sweeping motion that makes no splash. Just a low, musical creak-whoosh. Creak-whoosh. A hypnotic rhythm that vibrates up through the soles of your feet as you sit in the small, enclosed cabin in the center of the craft. This cabin is lined with clean, pale tatami mats and covered by a low, arched roof of woven bamboo mats, designed to protect the passengers from the river damp and the prying eyes of anyone looking down from the bridge railings above. Inside this tiny, floating room, the space is so intimate that two people must sit with their knees nearly touching. It is an architecture of absolute proximity, surrounded by a universe of black water and cool air. In the Edo period, these water taxis were frequently rented by lovers for a practice known as funayobai, boat crawling, an urban, sophisticated variation of the old countryside night-walking customs. For the price of a few silver coins, a couple could buy an hour or two of absolute isolation, sliding through the heart of the capital while wrapped in a privacy that no longhouse or mansion could ever provide. Imagine a young clerk from a wealthy wholesale house and a woman whose family commitments make their love a dangerous secret, sitting together in the dim amber light of a tiny paper lantern placed on the floorboards, its flame dancing with every gentle tilt of the boat. The intimacy found within the bamboo-roofed cabin was fluid, restless, and deeply romantic. It was an intimacy defined entirely by the sensation of movement, while the static world of the land was governed by fences, locks, and social decrees. The world of the boat was detached, floating on a current that answered only to the gravity of the moon. They would sit in the darkness, the cool wind blowing through the open ends of the cabin, carrying the spray of the river against their faces. They did not have to speak in whispers to evade the ears of neighbors. The low, constant murmur of the water rushing past the hull created a natural wall of sound that buried their words as soon as they were spoken. They could talk with a freedom that was impossible on shore, sharing their dreams of escaping to the distant northern provinces, or simply joking about the pomposity of the merchant masters who held their destinies in their ledgers. Let us look at the sensory details of these river journeys. The light inside the cabin is low and dramatic, throwing the silhouettes of the lovers against the woven bamboo roof in giant, dancing shapes. Through the open front of the boat, you can see the underside of the great timber bridges passing overhead. A sudden, heavy mass of dark beams and thick pillars that shuts out the stars for a few seconds before the boat emerges back into the moonlight. You smell the cold, clean scent of the river water, mixed with the warm tobacco smoke from a small long-stem pipe they share, and the sweet, rich fragrance of the winter plum blossoms planted in the gardens of the wealthy estates that line the upper reaches of the canal. The touch here is experimental, shaped by the gentle, unpredictable rocking of the boat. A hand reaches out to steady the other as the craft clips a floating log. Fingers interlocking tightly, feeling the warmth of the pulse against the cold canvas of the river air. There was a profound, bittersweet wit to this water life, a quality that the writers of the time called sway, a word that denoted a refined, worldly understanding of the floating world's rules. To be sway was to know that everything on the water was a temporary arrangement, that the boatman was paid to look away, that the cabin was rented by the hour, and that the river eventually emptied into the vast, gray emptiness of the bay. The lovers who used these boats had no illusions about the permanence of their sanctuary. They knew that when the dawn arrived, the chokibune would return to its mooring, the boatman would scrub the mats for the next customer, and they would have to step back onto the hard, unyielding earth of the land. This awareness didn't make them despair. It made them fastidious. It made them squeeze every drop of sweetness from the night, treating each passing bridge and each ripple of the tide as a precious, irreplaceable fragment of their shared existence. The hierarchy of the river also had its darker, more desperate currents. Farther down toward the mouth of the estuary, where the canals widened out into the brackish mudflats of the bay, lay the territory of the Itsabune, the prostitute boats. These were larger, clumsier craft than the swift water taxis, their hulls painted a crude, bright red that had grown peeling and salt-stained from the sea air. They were managed by old, hard-faced boatmen who operated them as floating brothels for the lowest classes of maritime laborers. The sailors, the loaders, and the coal heavers who lived in the squalor of the dockside shacks. The women who worked these boats were among the most vulnerable in the city, living entirely on the water, their skin roughened by the constant salt wind, their lungs heavy with the dampness of the bilge. They had no beautiful gardens to look upon, no golden screens, and no elegant calligraphy sets. Their rooms were tiny berths cut into the hold of the vessel, lit by cheap, foul-smelling fish oil lamps that threw a greasy black soot over everything. And yet, even in these floating cells, the human capacity for solidarity did not entirely wither. The women of the Itsabune were famous for their mastery of the river's folklore. They knew the songs of the southern islands brought by the grain ships. They knew how to read the weather in the color of the phosphorescence that glowed in the wake of the boat, and they maintained a fierce, sisterly protection over one another, sharing their meager rations of rice and sweet potatoes during the long weeks when the winter ice blocked the canals. As the third watch of the night approaches, the tide begins to turn. The water from the bay begins to push back up into the canals, slowing the movement of the river and causing the floating logs and timber rafts to bump against one another with a low, hollow thud-thud. Thud-thud, a sound that echoes through the empty warehouse districts like the beating of a distant drum. The boatman at the stern of your chokibune shifts his weight, turning the long oar to bring the craft around, heading back toward the quiet landing stage where the journey began. The small paper lantern in the cabin is finally burned out, its oil exhausted, leaving the interior in absolute, cool darkness. The lovers prepare themselves for the return to the land. They move with a quiet, practiced efficiency, straightening their sashes, tucking their hair back beneath their headbands, and collecting their small belongings in the dark. They do not weep, and they do not make grand scenes. The river has taught them the value of a quiet departure. When the bow of the boat touches the wooden piles of the pier with a soft, sliding bump, the man steps out first, turning to offer his hand to the women. For a second, their fingers hold each other in the cool morning air. A final, liquid touch. And then she steps onto the stone path, vanishing down a narrow alleyway between two great white storehouses before the watchman can turn his lantern corner. The boatman dips his oar once more, moving his craft back into the mid-current, leaving the landing stage empty. The river continues to flow, indifferent to the secrets it has carried, its dark surface erasing the wake of the boat as quickly as it was formed. This was the work of the canals. They were the great collectors of the city's hidden tears, the silent partners in a million forgotten romances, ensuring that the private passions of the capital were kept fresh, moving, and safe from the stagnant weight of the law. Let your own mind follow that slow, receding current. As the cold water of the canals fades from your senses, listen to the distant, lonely call of a harbor gull waking in the mist, a sound that signals the approaching end of the night. The storehouses and the great bridges are staying behind, wrapped in their shadows and their stone. But we carry the memory of the moving water with us. Rest your thoughts now. Let the image of the bamboo roof and the rocking boat dissolve into the soft, comforting dark of your own rest. And let your breath follow the slow, steady rhythm of the tide as it cradles the sleeping city. For in our final part, the sun will rise upon the last, quietest space of all, the domestic hearth of the morning, where the journey ends and the past joins the present in the light of the day. Part 8. The domestic hearth and the gathering of the light. Let the gentle rocking of the riverboat fade into a deep, immovable stillness, as we step off the fluid pathways of the canals and return, at last, to the solid, unpaved earth of the residential quarters. The long night is beginning to lose its absolute hold over the capital, though the world is still wrapped in a heavy, suspended slumber. We find ourselves back within the familiar grid of the Common and Nagaya districts, standing inside a single, modest room of a longhouse just as the very first, almost imperceptible hint of dawn begins to trace the eastern horizon. The air here is cool, thin, and remarkably pure, stripped of the heavy perfumes of the pleasure districts and the thick charcoal smoke of the daytime industry. It smells of coal ash in the brazier, the clean, slightly damp straw of the winter tatami mats, the faint, dry musk of cedarwood paneling, and the crisp, watery freshness of the morning dew settling upon the tiny patch of earth outside the sliding kitchen shutter. Listen closely, and you can hear the profound, collective silence of 500,000 people breathing together in the dark. A soft, rhythmic tide of human existence that fills the narrow lanes like a protective fog, holding the city safe in the moments before the world wakes up. You are sitting on the floorboards near the front entryway, your back resting against the smooth pine upright of the wall. The interior of the room is a landscape of soft, monochromatic grays. The furniture is sparse, reduced to the absolute essentials of daily survival. A low wooden chest with iron corners containing a family's spare winter robes, a small writing desk no larger than a horse blanket, and a small, round charcoal brazier, the hibachi, that sits cold and dark in the center of the room. The standard Andon oil lamp has long since burned its oil to the bottom of the brass dish, its wick a dead, black thread that releases a tiny, final wisp of white smoke into the cool air. In this dim, transitional hour, the rigid social constructs of the empire seem to carry no weight at all. The shogun in his great castle, the samurai behind his white walls, the courtesan in her golden room, and the poor weaver sleeping on these thin mats are all equally helpless, all equally bound by the democratic necessity of rest. It is here, in the quietest hours of the domestic realm, that the final, most enduring layer of Edo intimacy reveals itself. An intimacy that is not bought with coin, or demanded by honor, or stolen in a secret garden, but an intimacy grown out of the daily, repetitive rituals of shared survival. Look toward the corner of the room, where the heavy cotton futon is laid out over the rush grass mats. Underneath the thick quilt, two people are sleeping, their forms huddled close together to fight off the residual chill of the winter night. They are an ordinary couple of the capital, perhaps a young cooper who spends his days hammering iron hoops around cedar barrels, and his wife, who earns a few copper coins by spinning raw silk for a merchant guild. Their hands, resting on the edge of the blanket, are not the smooth, white hands of the aristocratic scholars or the powdered beauties of the floating world. They are rough, calloused, and stained with the marks of honest labor. Her fingers showing the small needle scars of the seamstress, his knuckles hardened by the impact of the adze and the mallet. And yet, in the symmetry of their resting positions, there is an absolute, unstudied grace. His arm is thrown casually over her shoulder, his fingers resting gently against the dark fabric of her nightrobe, while her head is nestled into the small hollow between his chest and his neck. This domestic closeness was the invisible foundation upon which the entire frantic prosperity of the capital was built. In a society where the individual was nothing and the household was everything, the marriage bond within the working class was an intense partnership of mutual reliance. They were not just lovers, they were a two-person crew navigating a fragile wooden boat through the dangerous rapids of a feudal economy. Every day was a shared battle against the high price of rice, the threat of the city's catastrophic fires, and the endless regulations of the neighborhood magistrates. This shared vulnerability created an emotional resonance that was deeper and more resilient than the fleeting passions celebrated in the popular puppet plays. It was an intimacy that didn't need to express itself in elegant calligraphy or scented smoke. It was written in the simple, unquestioning trust with which one body aligned itself with another in the dark, knowing that when the morning came, they would rise together to face the same heavy world. Let us look at the slow, exquisite gathering of the light in this quiet room. The darkness does not lift suddenly. It dissolves, grain by grain, as the sun climbs behind the thick fog of the eastern marshes. The translucent paper of the front shoji screen begins to change, turning from a deep, slate blue into a pale, milky gray, revealing the delicate silhouette of a single weeping willow branch hanging down from the neighbor's yard outside. This filtered light is incredibly gentle. It creeps across the green floor mats like a slow, silver liquid, illuminating the small details of the domestic scene. The two pairs of wooden clogs arranged neatly at the threshold, the small ceramic teapot resting on the edge of the cold hearth, and the tiny wooden shrine to Inari, the rice spirit, tucked onto a shelf near the ceiling, where a single dried foxtail of rice stalks stands as an offering for prosperity. As the light touches the edge of the futon, the woman stays. Her breath catches for a second, her eyelids fluttering open to look at the gray ceiling boards above her head. She does not move immediately. She remains still for a few minutes, listening to the familiar, steady rise and fall of her husband's chest against her shoulder. This moment of quiet orientation is a daily ritual, a brief pause to collect her thoughts before the immense labor of the day begins. She reaches out a hand, her long, unpainted sleeve trailing across the mat, and gently touches the side of his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw with a familiarity that requires no sight. It is a touch of pure recognition, an acknowledgement that they have survived another night, that the house is safe, and that they are still here, side by side, within the thin paper walls of their world. There is a dry, comfortable wit to this domestic morning, a quality that the commoners call the doko spirit, a mixture of resilience, humor, and a refusal to take the hardships of life too seriously. When the cooper finally wakes, his eyes blinking against the pale gray light, he doesn't offer a poetic verse about the morning dew. He lets out a long, theatrical groan, stretches his aching back until his joints pop like dry twigs, and makes a dry remark about how the winter cold makes his bones feel like they were constructed out of old bamboo poles. His wife responds with a soft, teasing laugh, sliding out from under the heavy quilt and reaching for her sash to tie her simple indigo robe. This humor was their shield, a way of greeting the daily grind with a smile rather than a sigh, an understanding that while they could not change the laws of the shogun or the price of the rice brokers, they could choose how they looked at each other across the morning fire. Now, the silence of the longhouse alley begins to break, not with a sudden explosion of sound, but with a series of predictable, comforting domestic noises that signal the awakening of the community. Through the thin plaster wall, you can hear the sharp scritch-scratch of a neighbor's straw broom sweeping the dirt path outside, followed by the heavy, metallic clatter of the iron bucket descending into the communal well at the back of the lane. You hear the slide of wooden shutters being opened all down the alleyway, a long, rolling sequence of wooden thuds that sounds like a line of small cannon fire echoing through the district. The city is pulling back its blankets, clearing its throat, and preparing its hearths. The wife moves into the tiny kitchen space near the front door, a narrow dirt floor area no larger than a stepping stone, containing a small clay cooking stove called shichirin. She takes a long bamboo pipe and blows through it into the base of the stove, encouraging the remaining embers of yesterday's charcoal to catch the dry pine needles she has placed there. The sound of her breath through the pipe is a soft, rhythmic huff, followed by a sudden, bright crackle as a small orange flame blooms in the dark iron belly of the stove. Within minutes, the air in the room begins to transform, taking on the deep, comforting, and elemental scent of the domestic morning. The smell of burning charcoal, the earthy steam of boiling water, and the rich, salty aroma of fermenting miso paste mixed with dried green seaweed cooking in a small iron pot. This was the ultimate altar of human warmth in the Edo period. The morning hearth, as the steam rises from the pot, curling up toward the soot-darkened rafters of the ceiling, it carries with it the absolute assurance of continuity. The husband sits cross-legged on the mats near the stove, his hands wrapped around a warm wooden bowl of rice, his face illuminated by the bright, cheerful glow of the charcoal fire. They eat in silence, their movements synchronized by years of shared routine, their bowls clinking softly against their wooden chopsticks. This is not the glamorous Ukiyo-e of the woodblock prince or the dramatic tragedies of the theater. This is the prose of history, the quiet, essential work of keeping the human fire burning in the middle of a cold and structured world. Our long journey through the private nights of old Japan is drawing to its natural close. We have walked the damp paths of the coastal ports where the secret letters were scented with smoke. We have stayed in the whispering inns of the great highway and shared the communal warmth of the steaming baths. We have peered through the paper walls of the suburban longhouses, stood behind the high, white fortresses of the samurai nobility, and witnessed the glittering, artificial paradise of the nightless city. We have found the silence of the mountain shrines and slid along the black canals and the bamboo cabins of the water taxes. But it is here, in this ordinary room, by the light of a simple charcoal stove, that the journey finds its true destination. For all those other spaces, the tea houses, the theaters, the palaces, and the riverboats, were merely escapes, temporary loops cut into the fabric of a rigid society. But this room, this shared bowl of morning rice, this is where life was actually lived. This was the anchor that kept the human heart from being swept away by the current of the floating world. Let your mind rest completely now, as the sun finally clears the eastern roofs, turning the gray mist into a brilliant, golden haze that fills the alleyway with warmth and light. The long night has ended. The shadows have retreated into the corners of the woodwork, and the daily theater of the capital is beginning to roar to life once more. You can hear the distant, high call of the natto sellers moving down the lane, the barking of the neighborhood dogs, and the laughter of children running toward the well. The past is no longer a dark, melancholic ghost. It is a warm, living landscape that breathes right beside you. Let your breathing become slow, steady, and perfectly even, aligned with the calm, morning pulse of this ancient house. The journey is complete, the stories have been told, and the secrets have been safely returned to the dock. You are safe, you are warm, and you are home. Rest your thoughts. Let the images of the charcoal smoke and the golden light dissolve into a serene, timeless peace. And let yourself drift away into the deepest, quietest sanctuary of your own rest. As the world outside continues to float, slow, beautiful, and completely at peace.